There is a substance that runs through the entire Bible, from the fourth chapter of the first book almost to the final page of the last. It is not water, it is not wine, it is not the oil that anointed kings and priests, it is blood. And the scale of it is startling. It appears hundreds of times, from Genesis to Revelation. It is there in the first murder in history. It is there on the night when an entire people flees from slavery. It is dripping on the altar of the temple. It is in a cup at the Last Supper. It is on the cross. And it is in heaven, at the end of everything, with a multitude dressed in white. The same thing from beginning to end. And here is what almost no one notices. If you understand what blood means in the Bible, you do not just understand a collection of ancient, bloody rituals. You understand the entire gospel. Every piece fits into one whole. And there is one detail about a golden object hidden in the most secret part of the temple that completely changes the way you read the story of Jesus. But we will build toward that. To understand why this liquid carries all of that weight, we have to go back to a verse almost everyone skips. It is buried in Leviticus, the book most people abandon halfway through, lost among sacrifice laws and lists of clean and unclean animals. Leviticus 17:11. Look at what is written there. For the life of the flesh is in the blood. And the verse continues, for it is the blood that makes atonement by the life. Stay with the first part for now. The life of the flesh is in the blood. For the people of Israel, this was not beautiful poetry. It was plain reality. The Hebrew word there for life is nephesh. It means life, soul, the whole living being. And the text says that this nephesh is in the blood. Take away the blood, and the life goes with it. And they saw this with their own eyes. The animal bled, and life escaped with the red stream flowing out. The conclusion was direct. Blood does not merely represent life. Blood is life, running outside the body. And that is why blood was treated with almost obsessive care. Eating blood was forbidden. Long before the law of Moses, back in Genesis 9:4, God had already warned Noah, you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. And why such strictness? Because life belongs to the one who gave life. The blood belongs to God, period. And here there is a contrast that shows how strange Israel was compared with its neighbors. Among surrounding peoples in the ancient world, the blood of sacrifices was sometimes offered as food for the gods, as though the deity fed on it. Israel does the opposite. Blood is never food. Blood is returned to God, because life was always his. It is not man feeding God. It is man recognizing that life was not his to begin with. Now hold on to this, because Hebrew hides a web of meaning that English cannot fully show. The word for blood is dam, 3 letters, remember it. Because the word for human being is Adam, the word for ground, the soil you cultivate, is Adamah, and the word for the color red is Adam. Dam, Adam, Adamah, Adam. Blood, man, ground, red. All springing from the same root, all tied to the same sound. Think about what that does to the creation story. The man, the Adam, is formed from the ground, the Adamah, reddish clay, and inside him runs the dam, the blood. In Hebrew logic, the human being is literally a creature of red earth with life running inside. When the author of Genesis builds this, it is not a random wordplay. It is a way of saying that we came from the ground and carry a life that is borrowed. And it is right there that the first human blood in the Bible is shed. Genesis 4, Cain kills Abel in the field, and God appears and asks the murderer a disturbing question. What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. Look at the choice of words. The blood cries out. The Hebrew verb there is tsa'ak. It is a cry. It is the scream of someone who has been robbed, someone who has suffered injustice and cries for help. And where does that cry rise from? From the ground, from the Adamah. The dam, the blood spilled on the Adamah, the soil from which the Adam, the man, was taken. The whole web closes in a single scene. The ground that brought forth life now drinks the life that was poured out, and it cries out for justice. Pay very close attention to what this blood asks for. Justice, vengeance. Abel's blood rises from the soil, demanding payment for a crime. Hold that tightly, because later, in the New Testament, another blood will appear that also speaks. But it speaks the exact opposite, a blood that, instead of demanding payment, forgives. And when you see the difference between these two kinds of blood, the whole gospel opens before you. But before that other blood arrives, blood still has enormous work to do. And the first task is protection. Let us go to the most important night in Israel's history, Exodus 12. The people have been enslaved in Egypt for generations. And God warns that he will pass through the land in one night, and death will strike every house. The instruction he gives is very specific. Each family kills a lamb, collects the blood, and puts it on the doorposts and the lintel, on the top and on both sides, using a branch of a plant called hyssop. It is not decoration, it is a mark. And God says in Exodus 12:13, "When I see the blood, I will pass over you." Notice the whole mechanism. It is not the family's faith that holds death back from that door. It is not good intentions, not merit. It is the blood, visible, applied on the outside. Where there is blood, death passes by. Where there is none, it enters. The blood of the lamb stands in the place of the family's life. One dies, the whole house survives. And remember this lamb too, because it will return later in a way no one expected. The second work of blood is to seal a covenant. And here a phrase appears that is worth gold, because Jesus will repeat it almost word for word, more than 1,000 years later. We are at Mount Sinai. Moses has just received the law. The people agree to live in that covenant with God. And to close the covenant, Moses does something that sounds shocking to us today. He takes the blood of the sacrificed animals and throws it on the people. In Exodus 24:8, he announces, "Behold the blood of the covenant, the blood of the covenant." Engrave that phrase deep in your memory. An agreement between God and human beings is not sealed with a handshake or a signature. It is sealed with blood. Because blood is life, and both sides are placing life on the table. It is not a paper contract. It is life committed to life, sealed with the most sacred thing that existed. And there is a detail about the sacrifices that many people understand backward. We imagine that the whole point was the animal's death, the suffering, the blow, the animal falling. But when you read Leviticus carefully, you notice that the text spends very few words on the death itself. What it describes in detail, repeating again and again, is what the priest does with the blood afterward. The blood is thrown against the altar, sprinkled, applied to specific places. The Hebrew verb is zarak, to throw, to scatter with force. The entire ritual revolves around what is done with the blood. And that is not ornamental, it is the heart of the system. Because, again, the blood is the life. It was not enough for the animal to die. The life that escaped the blood had to be taken and applied in the right place, in the right way. Death was only the beginning. The real work was with the blood. And there is a third stage where blood performs the heaviest work of all, once a year, one day only, the most solemn day in the entire calendar of Israel, the Day of Atonement. Leviticus 16 describes the scene. Once a year, and only once, the high priest enters the most sacred place of the temple, the Holy of Holies, the room where the Ark of the Covenant stood, and where, according to the text, the presence of God was manifested. No one enters there except him on that one day, and never empty-handed. He enters carrying blood, the blood of a bull for his own sins, and the blood of a goat for the sins of the whole people. What he does with that blood is the detail that matters. In Leviticus 16:14, it is written that he sprinkles the blood before the mercy seat 7 times. 7. Why 7? Because in the Bible, 7 is the number of what is complete, finished, perfect. The purification has to be total. No stain can remain. The whole year of failures, mistakes, accumulated defilement, all of it has to be cleansed at once. And here comes the word that organizes everything: atonement. In Hebrew, kafar or kippah. The best known translation is to cover, in the sense of covering sin. But some scholars go back to the older root of the word and say the original sense is different: to wipe, to cleanse, to purge. In this reading, the blood does not hide the dirt on the surface. The blood cleanses the dirt from within. It works like a sacred detergent, washing away the defilement that had accumulated in the sanctuary and among the people throughout the year. Seen this way, the Day of Atonement was the day of the great cleansing, and the only cleansing agent that worked was blood. And it is exactly on that golden cover, on top of the ark, that the detail I promised at the beginning is found. This cover has its own name, and that name, when the Old Testament was translated into Greek, became a word that the Apostle Paul would later use to describe not a piece of furniture, not an object, but a person. And the moment those two words meet, the entire story of blood, from Abel to the cross, closes into one point. We will come to that meeting carefully in a little while, because look at everything blood has already done so far. It is life. It cries out for justice. It protects from death. It seals the covenant. It cleanses defilement. 5 different works spread across 5 different scenes in the Old Testament. But there is a tension that the Old Testament never resolves. All this blood poured out year after year, animal after animal, never stops flowing. The sacrifice is repeated because the work is never finished. Every year the high priest returns to the Holy of Holies. Every year the blood flows again and again and again. But what if one single sacrifice could end that repetition forever? A blood that flows only once and never needs to flow again. That is exactly what a carpenter from Galilee came to say he would do. And to understand the size of what he did, we first had to understand all of this. What blood is, what blood does, and why, according to the Bible, none of this works without it. So let us go to the night when this carpenter gathers his closest friends for a final meal. And it is not just any date. It is Passover, the same feast that remembered the lamb killed in Egypt. The blood placed on the doorframe, death passing by the marked house. More than 1,000 years later, Israel still stopped everything to relive that night. And it is precisely at this supper that Jesus lifts a cup of wine before the disciples and says a sentence that should have frozen the whole table. Matthew 26:28. For this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. The blood of the covenant. You have already heard that phrase today. It is what Moses announced at Mount Sinai when he threw the blood of the animals on the people. Exodus 24:8. The same words, but there is one difference that changes everything. At Sinai, the blood was from goats and bulls. At the supper, Jesus does not point to any animal. He points to himself. The blood of the new covenant will not come from a lamb on an altar. It will come from him. And there is a small word at the end of that sentence worth stopping over: forgiveness of sins. The word that appears there in Greek is aphesis. It was not a pretty religious term. It was a debt term. It meant the cancellation of a debt, the release of a prisoner. When someone owed something and the debt was erased, this was the word. So what Jesus is saying with the cup in his hand is that this blood will cancel an account. It will wipe away what stood recorded against people. And then the question is simple. Why at Passover? Why exactly at this feast? Remember the lamb I asked you to keep in mind. The one in Egypt, the one that died so the whole house could live. It is now returning, and in a way no one at that table had understood yet. In fact, even before this supper, at the very beginning of Jesus' public ministry, a man had already pointed to him and said something strange. John the Baptist. When he saw Jesus coming, he said in John 1:29, "Behold, the Lamb of God, who takes away the sin of the world." Lamb, not king, not general, not judge. Lamb. The word every Jew immediately associated with one thing: sacrifice. And look at how the story closes. Jesus is killed at Passover, in the same period when the lambs were being slaughtered in the temple for the feast. While the people were killing their lambs, the man John had called the Lamb of God was dying nailed to a cross. And there are two details in the scene of the cross that the Gospel of John makes absolutely sure to record. The first seems small, almost insignificant. Jesus is on the cross, thirsty, and the soldiers soak a sponge in sour wine to bring it to his mouth. And on what do they lift that sponge? John 19:29 answers, on a hyssop branch. Hyssop. Stop everything. You have already heard of this plant today. It was exactly hyssop that the families in Egypt used to brush the blood of the lamb onto the doorposts back in Exodus 12. The same little plant. Of all the things John could mention in that scene, he chooses that one. Coincidence? For someone who knew Exodus by heart, it was a flashing sign. This is the true Passover. The lamb is on the cross, and the hyssop has returned to put the blood in place. The second detail is about the bones. There was an ancient rule about the Passover lamb. None of its bones could be broken. It is written in Exodus 12:46, the lamb had to go into the fire whole, and when the soldiers begin breaking the legs of those crucified to hasten their deaths, they come to Jesus and realize he is already dead. They do not break any of his bones. And John, in 1936, freezes the scene to explain why. For these things took place, that the scripture might be fulfilled. Not one of his bones will be broken. He is citing the rule of the lamb. The true lamb also remained whole. Now we return to the promise left hanging earlier. Two kinds of blood that speak. Remember Abel's blood? Rising from the ground, crying out, demanding payment from the brother who murdered him. Back in Genesis 4. There is a passage in the New Testament that deliberately places the two kinds of blood side by side for comparison. Hebrews 12:24. The author speaks of Jesus and his blood this way: the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. A better word. Both speak, but they say opposite things. Abel's blood spoke by demanding payment. It asked that the guilty one pay. It was the cry of the victim demanding justice. Jesus' blood also speaks, but it says the opposite. Instead of crying, "Make the guilty one pay," it announces the price has already been paid. One accuses, the other forgives. One opens the case, the other cancels the debt. It is the same substance, the same red thread running through the whole Bible, speaking two messages that are exact opposites. And pay attention to the irony that lives right there. Cain shed Abel's blood to get rid of his brother, and that blood became a witness of accusation against him for all eternity. Jesus' blood was shed by people who also wanted to get rid of him, and it became the very forgiveness for those who shed it. The blood that should condemn the murderers is the same blood that absolves the murderers. And now we arrive at the detail I promised in the first minute. That golden cover on top of the ark, hidden in the most secret place of the temple. Remember it? That was where the high priest sprinkled the blood 7 times, once a year on the Day of Atonement. This cover had a name in Hebrew, kaporet, and it is not an isolated name. It comes from the same root as kippur, atonement, the word we saw a moment ago. The cover of atonement, literally the place where the thing happened. And it was not just another piece of furniture in the corner of the room. It was the meeting point. In Exodus 25:22, God says to Moses, "There from above that cover, I will meet with you." The Bible describes God as enthroned between the two golden cherubim that stood over it. It was the throne, and the blood of the Day of Atonement was brought and applied exactly there at the foot of God's throne. Life, the blood, touching the holiest place that existed. Now follow this carefully, because this is where the entire thread is tied together. About 2 centuries before Jesus, the Jews translated the Old Testament into Greek. And when they came to this word, kaporet, the cover of the ark, they had to choose a Greek term. They chose one, hilasterion. Remember that sound, hilasterion. That was the Greek name for that golden place where the blood was applied before God. Why does this matter so much? Because there is one place in the New Testament where this exact word, hilasterion, appears again. One single time, at a decisive moment. The Apostle Paul is writing to the Romans, trying to explain what God did through Jesus. And he reaches for this very word, Romans 3:25. Paul says that God put forward Jesus as hilasterion by his blood to be received by faith. Stop for a second and let that sink in. The word that described the golden cover, the throne where blood touched to make atonement, Paul takes that word and attaches it to Jesus, not to an object, to a person. And what this says is staggering. That cover was never the final destination. It was a model, a figure made of gold, of something still to come. The true place where blood meets God and sin is cleansed is not a piece of furniture inside a temple. It is a person on a cross. The high priest brought the blood to the place of atonement. Jesus did not bring it. He is the place of atonement, and the blood applied there is his own. And there is a scene at the exact moment of Jesus' death that confirms all of this. Remember that no one entered the Holy of Holies, that there was a heavy curtain separating that place from the rest of the temple, hiding the presence of God behind fabric. Matthew 27:51 says that at the moment Jesus dies, that curtain is torn from top to bottom in two. Notice the direction, not from bottom to top, as if a man had pulled with force, from top to bottom, as if the hand came from above. The barrier that isolated God from the people, torn open right when the blood of the Lamb was flowing. The way that remained closed all year, opened wide in a single moment. And this is what resolves the tension the Old Testament had never been able to close. Remember the problem? The blood of animals never stopped flowing, every year again. The work was never finished. The letter to the Hebrews presses exactly on this point. It says that the high priest entered year after year, always with blood that was not his own. But Jesus entered once for all, by means of his own blood, and secured an eternal redemption. It is in Hebrews 9:12, once for all. The expression that appears there in Greek is ephipax, once and for all. It is not repeated. It does not need to be repeated. And think about the weight this removes from the shoulders. That whole calendar of repetition, the high priest returning, the blood flowing again and again, year after year, was living proof that none of it had truly ended. Work that has to be redone is work that was never completed. What the cross announces is the opposite. It is finished. There is no next year. The work is closed. And that is why that sentence from Leviticus, which seemed like only an old and dusty sacrifice rule, becomes the key to the entire gospel. Without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness. Hebrews 9:22 repeats it almost word for word, carrying it from the Old Testament into the New. Notice how interesting this is. The rule never changed. It still stands. What changed was whose blood it was. And then we arrive at the end of everything in the last book in Revelation. The Bible that began with blood crying from the ground ends with a scene in heaven. John sees a multitude no one can number, people from every nation clothed in white. And he asks who those people are. The answer comes in Revelation 7:14. They are the ones who have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. Notice the image, because it is deliberately impossible. Washing clothes in blood. In the real world, blood stains. Blood marks things red, and it is the last thing you would use to wash white fabric. But here it does the opposite of what it would normally do. It makes white, it cleanses. This is the last time blood appears in the Bible, doing what it did on the Day of Atonement, washing away uncleanness from within. But now complete, final. The garments will not be stained again. The cleansing does not need to be repeated the following year. It became white forever. And this is what turns blood into the secret key of the whole Bible. Look at the path it traveled. It began as life running inside the first man, made from red clay. It was spilled on the ground by the first murderer and cried out for justice. It marked the doors in Egypt and held death outside. It sealed the covenant at Sinai. It cleansed the sanctuary on the Day of Atonement, year after year, without ever declaring the work finished. And in the end, on one single day, in one single lamb, it did all of that once for all. It protected, it sealed, it cleansed, it forgave, and it stopped flowing. These were not separate stories. They were one story, told in pieces across centuries, with the same red substance stitching every chapter together underneath. Abel's blood asked for justice and could not bring Abel back. The blood of goats covered for 1 year and soon had to flow again. They were shadows, they pointed forward. They were all waiting for a blood that could say, "It is finished," and never have to say it again. And that is why, to this day, Christians lift a cup and drink from it in remembrance of blood. That gesture from the Last Supper did not end at the Last Supper. It is the covenant being remembered, repeated, generation after generation, with the same words Moses proclaimed at Sinai and Jesus placed upon himself. The blood of the covenant. So when you understand what blood means, you do not merely understand an ancient and bloody ritual. You understand why the lamb in Egypt had to die in place of the house, why the cover of the ark was called what it was called, why a curtain tore by itself from top to bottom, and why, at the end of everything, a multitude dressed in white sings before a lamb. Every piece was, at the deepest level, the same piece. And the thread that connects them all, from Genesis to Revelation, is red. If this video showed you something you had not seen before, send it to someone who would also like to discover it. Leave your like below and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next ones. And I will see you in the next video.